The terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with activity. A swirling mass of travelers moving either with determination or, in some instances, fatigue. Michael Carter adjusted the strap of his well-worn leather bag and pulled the hood of his gray sweatshirt up over his head. He didn't require a disguise. People seldom looked twice at a man who melded into the crowd. For 4 years, he had watched his name flash across news headlines. Michael Carter, the aviation mogul, billionaire visionary. But today, he wasn't a CEO, nor a man of influence. He was merely another passenger in economy class, seated in 24B, an aisle seat towards the rear of the aircraft. He had built Carter Airlines from the ground up, driven by the conviction that every passenger, irrespective of class or wealth, deserved respect. Recently, though, whispers of complaints had surfaced, rumors of a subtle shift in the airline's culture that favored the elite while overlooking everyone else. If there was an issue within his airline, he needed to observe it firsthand. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he inhaled deeply. The scent of recycled air mixed with faint traces of coffee filled his nostrils. "Welcome aboard." A flight attendant at the entrance greeted him with a polite yet mechanical smile. Michael nodded as he made his way down the narrow aisle. His seatmate was already there, a man in his late 30s clad in a navy blue suit, typing furiously on his phone. When Michael settled into his seat, the man glanced at him briefly before returning to his screen. Daniel Harris, that was the name on the boarding pass peeking from his blazer pocket. A lawyer, judging by the intense concentration and the leather briefcase tucked neatly under his seat. The plane filled up rapidly with the familiar sounds of conversation, bags rustling, and the decisive clicks of overhead bins shutting. Then, the cabin crew began their routine, and that's when Michael noticed her. Lisa Thompson, with blonde hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail, her uniform pressed to perfection, and a carefully practiced smile on her lips. She moved with precision, catering first to passengers in first class, offering warm greetings and light laughter. However, as she approached the economy section, her demeanor shifted, the warmth dwindling to subtle indifference. Michael observed her closely as she tended to a well-dressed couple in seats 23A and 23B, leaning slightly towards them and speaking softly, ensuring all their requests were met with a different level of care. When she reached his row, her gaze skimmed over him for a split second before she turned away to address a passenger across the aisle instead. He had become invisible to her. Michael remained silent. He had seen enough in business to recognize the significance of first impressions. "Excuse me," he ventured, testing her reaction. Lisa turned back, arching an expertly shaped brow. "Yes. Could I get a glass of water?" His voice was calm, even amiable. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll bring it later." Before he could respond, she had already moved on. Daniel, the lawyer beside him, let out a quiet chuckle. "That was quick," he muttered, still tapping away on his phone. Michael glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Daniel smirked, finally looking up. "She barely acknowledged you, but when she was up in first class, she was practically hosting a dinner party." Michael held his tongue, but a seed of confirmation had been sown inside him. The flight continued with the usual announcements, the takeoff, and the slight turbulence as they climbed to cruising altitude. The first round of beverage service commenced, and Lisa returned to their row. She poured wine for the couple in front and served sparkling water to another passenger sporting a Rolex. Finally reaching Michael, he asked again, not rudely, simply, "Could I have that water now?" Lisa didn't even bother with a smile. "We're out." Michael blinked. "Out of water?" She offered no further explanation and instead turned to the next row, her tone instantly brightening as she asked, "Can I get you anything to drink?" Michael watched as she handed a bottle of water to another passenger right in front of him. The lawyer beside him let out a quiet exhale, shaking his head in disbelief. Michael's grip tightened on the armrest. He didn't react, yet. Instead, he made a mental note. This wasn't merely one bad employee. It was a symptom of a more profound issue. The hum of the aircraft enveloped the cabin, a steady white noise that Michael had always found strangely reassuring. It was a sound he associated with progress, movement, and control. Yet, at that moment, seated in 24B, he felt something alien, disconnection. His company, the airline he had founded with a vision of treating every passenger with dignity, was revealing a side he had never witnessed firsthand. Lisa Thompson's casual disregard for economy passengers was not just a personal bias, it was too precise, too intentional. She acted without hesitation, as if she were following a script. Michael leaned back slightly, observing as she continued down the aisle, tending to others with subtle variations in tone and attentiveness. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit received a warm smile and an extra napkin, while a young woman in a hoodie and leggings got a monotonal "Here you go," as her drink was handed over without any eye contact. The pattern was unmistakable. Michael was not the only one paying attention. Daniel Harris, his seatmate, the keen lawyer beside him, sighed and tossed his phone onto his tray table. "Isn't it fascinating?" Michael turned his head slightly. "What is?" Daniel smirked. "The hierarchy of service. If you're wearing a suit, you get a different tone, a different level of patience. If you're dressed like a regular guy," he gestured loosely towards Michael's hoodie and jeans, "you become an afterthought." Michael exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "You sound like someone who's been observing for a while." Daniel chuckled lightly. "Let's just say I deal with cases like this regularly. Discrimination isn't always loud. It's quiet, practiced, systematic." He stretched his legs out, glancing towards the front of the cabin. "And that flight attendant? She's not creating it on her own. Someone trained her to behave this way." A cold certainty settled in Michael's chest. He had suspected thus, but hearing it articulated by someone completely uninvolved with the company made it real. Suddenly, a crackle from the PA system interrupted their conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will soon begin meal service in our economy cabin. Please remain seated as our crew makes their way through the aisle." Michael watched as Lisa and another flight attendant, a younger man with anxious eyes, began distributing meals. Initially, the process went smoothly. Passengers in the first few rows received their trays without issue. But as Lisa approached their section, the atmosphere shifted. Michael observed carefully as the passengers ahead of him received their meals, a chicken option and a vegetarian pasta dish. Lisa smiled politely, nodding as she placed their trays down. Then she reached Michael's row. He looked up, ready to make his request, but before he could speak, Lisa turned away entirely, serving Daniel his meal first before moving on to the next row as if Michael didn't exist. Midway through opening his tray, Daniel paused, turning his head slowly, his brows furrowing together. "Did she just?" Michael inhaled deeply, keeping his voice even. "Lisa!" She stopped, looking back over her shoulder, visibly irritated. "Yes. I didn't receive a meal." Lisa blinked. Her voice clipped. "Oh, we must be out. Sorry." Michael felt the tension in the air change. Other passengers were listening now. His voice remained calm, but he could sense Lisa's growing impatience. "The row in front of me received their meals, and the row behind me is still being served. Are you certain you're out?" Lisa's jaw tightened. Daniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "This is getting ridiculous." Lisa shot him a sharp look. "Excuse me," Daniel continued, keeping his tone even. "This is absurd. I watched you hand out plenty of trays before you skipped him. So either you genuinely ran out of meals in a span of 5 seconds, or you chose not to serve him." Michael stayed silent, observing the exchange. Lisa's cheeks flushed slightly. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, turning back toward the front of the cabin. Daniel let out a long breath, leaning back in his seat. Have you ever experienced something so absurd that you start wondering if you're imagining it? Michael finally let out a quiet chuckle. "More times than I'd like to admit." But internally, his thoughts were already racing ahead. This wasn't just about Lisa. It wasn't merely a single employee with a bad attitude. It was a pattern, and patterns indicate structure. Michael had spent decades learning to spot a failing system, and at that moment, He was watching his own company unravel from within. He needed proof, the first crack in the system. By the time Lisa disappeared toward the front of the cabin, the mood in economy had transformed. People were noticing. A woman across the aisle leaned towards Michael. "That was so weird," she whispered. "Why did she act like that?" Michael merely smiled. "Good question." Daniel, who had been silently considering, suddenly spoke up. "What do you do for a living, anyway?" Michael tilted his head slightly. "Why do you ask?" Daniel smirked. "Because you're too calm. Most people would have made a scene by now, demanded to speak to a supervisor. But you're just watching, like you're studying this." Michael chuckled. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in how this airline runs." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Before Michael could respond, he overheard something interesting near the crew area. Further up the cabin, Lisa was speaking to someone in hushed tones. He turned his head slightly to listen. "Just following orders," she said. A male voice, probably the younger flight attendant, answered, "But it's weird, right? Like we're not even being subtle about it." Lisa sighed. "Look, it's what the higher-ups want. Focus on the high-value customers. Keep the premium passengers happy. That's how we secure better numbers." The younger attendant hesitated. "Still, it feels wrong." Lisa's voice dropped lower. "If you want to keep this job, you'll do what you're told." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. There it was, proof that this wasn't just a one-time incident. It was policy. And now, Michael Carter had all the validation he needed. Michael Carter had dedicated his life in boardrooms, making billion-dollar decisions, negotiating contracts, and analyzing every small detail of his airline's operations. Yet, at that moment, seated in 24B, he had never felt more like an outsider within his own company. He had witnessed enough. Lisa Thompson's glaring neglect of economy passengers was not simply a matter of personal bias. It was a directive from above. The quiet conversation he had eavesdropped on near the crew area confirmed it. Somewhere within Carter Airlines, someone in upper management had made the choice to prioritize wealth over the rest, hiding behind company memos while subtly shifting policy. Michael knew that one poorly behaving flight attendant could be dismissed as an anomaly, but a systemic issue required more profound action. He was about to deliver precisely that. The tipping point. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles International Airport as passengers fastened their seat belts, stretched, and prepared for landing. Lisa was making her final round through the cabin. Michael turned to Daniel. "How much do you know about corporate policies?" Daniel smirked. "I'm a lawyer. I live and breathe policies." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "What about corporate corruption?" Daniel's smirk elevated. "That's my forte." Michael tapped his fingers on the armrest, contemplating his next words. "Let's just say I have a personal stake in what happened on this flight, and I'm determined to ensure the right people are held accountable." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "All right, now I'm curious. Who exactly are you?" Michael didn't offer an answer. Not yet. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway as the cabin crew delivered their final announcements. The moment the fastened seatbelt sign turned off, the usual chaos ensued. Passengers reached for their bags, stretching and moving into the aisle, eager to disembark. Lisa, now by the front of the plane, appeared relaxed and entirely oblivious to what was about to unfold. The moment of truth. Michael didn't rush to leave. Instead, he waited until most passengers had exited, ensuring that the crew and key airline staff were still present. Then he rose calmly, adjusted his bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the front of the plane. Lisa noticed him approaching and barely acknowledged him as she turned her attention to the cockpit. "Lisa!" She glanced back, irritation flashing across her face. "Sir, if you need to exit." Michael didn't allow her to finish. "I won't be exiting just yet," he replied smoothly, though the weight in his tone caused her to pause. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the remaining crew to hear, he stated, "My name is Michael Carter. I own this airline, and I need to have a conversation with you." Silence enveloped the cabin. Lisa's face lost its color. The younger flight attendant froze mid-step, looking as if he wished to disappear. The pilot, who had just stepped out of the cockpit, halted in his tracks. The only sound was the faint hum of the aircraft's ventilation system. Lisa opened her mouth and closed it again. "You're joking," she said, forcing a laugh, though her hands clutched the service cart just a bit too tightly. Michael pulled out his ID badge, the one every senior executive at Carter Airlines would recognize. Lisa stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Michael allowed the silence to extend before speaking again. "I was on this flight as a passenger, not as your boss, nor as a billionaire, but as an ordinary traveler seated in 24B. His voice was steady, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet intensity. Lisa swallowed hard, remaining silent. Michael continued, "What I saw is unacceptable. The intentional prioritization of passengers based on perceived status, the dismissive treatment, the skipping of service. That's not just poor customer service." He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "That's systemic discrimination." Lisa's hands trembled a bit. The younger flight attendant directed his gaze towards the ground, avoiding eye contact while the pilot, now fully attentive, exchanged worried glances with another crew member, sensing the gravity of the situation. Then, from behind Michael, a voice spoke up. "Actually, Mr. Carter, it's worse than that." Unmasking the truth, Michael turned to see Daniel Harris, the lawyer, stepping forward. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes held intensity. Lisa shot him a wary glance. Michael narrowed his gaze. "Go on." Daniel held up his phone, tapping on the screen. "I recorded a rather interesting conversation during this flight." He played back the earlier conversation Michael had overheard, Lisa discussing following orders, the younger flight attendant hesitating, and the mention of higher-ups enforcing policies. Lisa's face blanched as the pilot's jaw tightened. Michael listened, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Lisa. "Who told you to follow this policy?" Lisa hesitated. It's just how things have been lately." Michael's tone remained steady. "Who instructed you?" Lisa exhaled sharply, turning her gaze away. "It came from corporate. I don't know exactly who. The memo just indicated we should prioritize high-value passengers first." Michael felt a tightening in his stomach. So it wasn't merely Lisa. It didn't only involve one flight attendant. Someone high up in his own company had made the decision, and they had concealed it from him. Michael straightened. "Lisa, you will be placed on immediate suspension pending a review." Her face crumpled, but she didn't protest. She understood the seriousness of her actions. Then Michael addressed the pilot. "I want the names of the executives pushing this policy. Every single one." The pilot nodded gravely. Turning back to Daniel, Michael asked, "Would you be interested in taking on a corporate ethics case?" Daniel smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." With a decisive nod, Michael finally turned towards the exit. Work awaited him. Michael Carter stepped off the plane with determination in his stride. The humid air of Los Angeles greeted him as he walked through the jet bridge. Although he barely noticed, his mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the puzzle. Lisa's actions had been overt, but the underlying issue wasn't solely about her. It was about who had given the orders. Somewhere inside Carter Airlines, upper management had made the decision to favor the wealthy at the cost of others, concealing their actions behind company memos that facilitated subtle yet dangerous policy shifts. Michael felt not only anger but betrayal. This wasn't the airline he had established. The immediate fallout began as he stepped into the terminal. Daniel Harris, the lawyer, kept pace beside him. "So," Daniel said casually, "what's your next move?" Michael exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "First, find out exactly who's behind this." Daniel nodded, his gaze sharp. "And when you do?" Michael's voice was resolute. "I don't care what it takes, they're out." Daniel smirked. "I like your style." Michael stopped near gate 14. pulling out a number he rarely called, the direct line to Carter Airlines executive board. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Mr. Carter?" It was Robert Langley, Chief Operating Officer of the airline. His voice maintained its usual professional calm, but there was a tightness in his tone. Michael wasted no time. "Robert, I need an emergency meeting with the entire senior executive team today." There was a pause. "Sir, what's this about?" Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "I think you already know." Silence. Then Robert said cautiously, "I'll have the boardroom ready in 2 hours." Michael hung up. This was going to be a war. The corporate web. 2 hours later, Michael stepped into Carter Airlines headquarters in Los Angeles. The executive boardroom was a sleek glass-walled room that overlooked the city skyline. Inside, 7 senior executives sat around the table, all in crisp suits, their faces unreadable. He took his seat at the head. He didn't greet them, didn't smile. He placed his phone on the table, pressed play. Lisa's recorded conversation filled the silent room. "It's what the higher-ups want. Focus on the high-value customers. Keep the premium passengers happy. That's how we secure better numbers." When the recording concluded, Michael let the silence stretch. Then, with a voice sharp as glass, he asked, "Who authorized this?" Some of the executives exchanged glances, shifting in their seats, but no one spoke. Finally, Robert Langley, cleared his throat. "Michael, before we get emotional about this." Michael leaned forward slowly. "Emotional?" His voice was dangerously calm. "Robert, do I look emotional to you?" Langley hesitated. This strategy was discussed in internal meetings. We saw an opportunity to enhance our premium experience. Studies show that wealthier passengers expect more tailored service. And frankly, economy customers. Michael interrupted. "Stop." The room fell still. Michael's cold, unwavering gaze was fixed on Langley. "Do you know why I started this airline?" Michael's voice remained, yet with a steely undercurrent. No one responded. "Because I grew up poor. I was the child whose family scrimped to afford a single flight each year. And when we did fly, we were treated like nobodies, like we didn't belong. I vowed to build an airline that treated every single person with dignity." His voice hardened. "And you? You turned my airline into exactly what I fought against." Langley fidgeted, but Michael was not finished. "This isn't a business strategy. It's class-based discrimination." Silence enveloped the room. Another executive, Karen Liu, Chief Marketing Officer, spoke cautiously. "Michael, we weren't trying to discriminate. We were simply aiming to elevate our brand perception in the high-value market." Michael's jaw tightened. "By treating economy passengers like garbage?" She hesitated. "It wasn't supposed to be that evident." Michael let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You thought you could subtly dehumanize people, and no one would notice?" She looked away. "Michael," he said, his voice dropping lower, "let me make one thing perfectly clear. Carter Airlines doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. My company will not, and will never, operate like this." Michael stood, bracing his hands against the table. "Effective immediately. Lisa Thompson is suspended. But she's merely a symptom of the real issue." His gaze swept the room. "And the real problem is seated right here." Langley exhaled through his nose. "Michael, be reasonable. These were high-level business decisions." Michael cut him off. "You're fired." Langley's expression hardened. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Michael replied, his voice unwavering. "You implemented a discriminatory policy behind my back. You breached everything Carter Airlines stands for." Karen Liu, the marketing executive, sat rigidly in her seat. "Michael, let's discuss this." "You're fired too." Karen gasped, and Michael straightened his jacket. "And let me be crystal clear. Anyone else in this room involved in this policy has 5 seconds to resign or I will fire you myself." Silence followed. Then one by one, 3 executives stood, accepting their fate. Michael didn't look away. His company would be rebuilt the right way. As Michael exited the boardroom, Daniel Harris was waiting outside. "So," Daniel asked, "what's the outcome?" Michael exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. 4 executives gone. Daniel smirked. "Damn. Remind me never to get on your bad side." Michael chuckled tiredly. "This isn't about revenge. It's about mending what's broken." Daniel crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" Michael gazed out the window, watching the Carter Airlines planes take off in the distance. "Now," he said quietly, "we rebuild this company the way it was meant to be." A week passed since Michael Carter cleaned house at Carter Airlines. The fallout was immediate and severe. Headlines swamped the business world. Carter Airlines CEO fires executives over discriminatory practices. And Michael Carter takes stand against class-based bias in airline industry. Aviation mogul declares respect shouldn't have a price tag. Inside the company, reactions varied. Some executives panicked, fearing instability, while others, especially employees who had witnessed the cultural shift firsthand, felt something they hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. For 4 years, they had observed the slow erosion of Carter Airlines' founding principles. Now it was evident that change was underway. Michael had made a statement, and the industry had received it loud and clear. Rebuilding the company, Michael sat in his Los Angeles office, staring at a stack of reports before him. Flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives, they all came forward after the news broke, confirming what he already knew. This issue ran deep. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Michael said. The door opened, and Daniel Harris stepped inside, holding 2 coffee cups. "Figured you might need this," he said, setting one down. Michael accepted it with a nod. "You always arrive at the perfect time." Daniel smirked. "It's a lawyer thing." He sat across from Michael. "So, how's damage control?" Michael sighed. "It's not damage control. It's rebuilding." He gestured to the papers on his desk. "We're rewriting internal policies. Every employee, from executives to flight attendants, is going through retraining. No more hidden memos. No more high-value passengers first." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And Lisa?" Michael leaned back, exhaling slowly. "She's undergoing a mandatory ethics and customer service program. If she completes it, she can reapply. But I told her, if she ever treats a passenger like that again, she's out for good." Daniel nodded. "Fair. She was following orders. But that doesn't absolve her of blame." Michael took a sip of coffee. "No, and neither was I." Daniel tilted his head. "You?" Michael exhaled. "I took my hands off the wheel and trusted the wrong people. Allowed my company to drift from everything I built it to be." Daniel studied him for a moment. "And now?" Michael's grip tightened around the coffee cup. "Now I fix it, restoring the trust of the people." A month later, Carter Airlines held a press conference. Michael stood at the podium, facing reporters, cameras, and the scrutiny of an industry that had been tracking his every move. He adjusted the microphone. "When I started Carter Airlines, my goal was straightforward: to build an airline where every passenger is treated with dignity, regardless of their background or seating class." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Recently, I discovered that my own company had deviated from those values. Certain executives implemented policies that prioritized wealth over service, and that's unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Michael's voice remained resolute. "Those executives are no longer part of this company. We are rewriting our policies, retraining our staff, and clarifying that every customer deserves respect." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Carter, some say your actions were extreme, that firing senior executives could harm the company. What's your response?" Michael didn't hesitate. "If standing up for fairness is extreme, then I'm happy to be labeled as such." Silence blanketed the room, followed by applause. It started softly but soon grew louder, resonating through the space. Michael glanced at the front row, where employees from all levels of the company sat. Flight attendants, customer service agents, mechanics, people who had witnessed both the decline and resurgence of Carter Airlines' values. For the first time in a long while, he observed pride in their eyes. One final flight. 3 months later, Michael Carter boarded another flight. This time, he didn't conceal his identity. He walked down the aisle, shaking hands with crew members, chatting with passengers. When the flight attendant came to take his drink order, she smiled and asked, "Mr. Carter, can I get you anything?" Michael smiled in return. "Water's just fine, thank you." She handed it to him without hesitation, and this time, it wasn't just for show. The lasting message. Settled back in his seat, Michael Carter looked around the cabin, observing people from all walks of life as they prepared for the journey ahead. This airline, this business, wasn't solely about profits, it was about people. And now, he was determined to ensure it would always remain that way.